Treble hooks are common on all kinds of fishing hooks, and they're very popular with some people, but others don't like them at all. We're going to talk about all things treble hooks, including maintenance and replacement, on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us as always by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com for all of your holiday needs. They will ship directly to a store closest to you if you would like, and there's more than 140 of them nationwide, so there's probably one nearby. And also don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Northern Colorado, ready to service all of your Tundra, Tacoma, or any other Toyota needs. Guys, just got a question, came in through email, and it's the second time in a week it's come in through email. And as I've said before in other podcasts, whenever several of you reach out to me about the same thing, I assume there's going to be more that have that question out there. And it's one that over the 20 years I've been doing this, we've had lots of questions on. And so I wanted to address the topic of treble hooks. And treble hooks are, like I said in the beginning, very common. They're very popular with some people. You see them on a whole giant range of lures, but they're not without drawbacks in some ways. And there's some areas where they're not legal, and there's some people that just don't want to use them. And I thought I would go into all of those things and make this a short but sweet podcast, because it's not a terribly complicated topic, but it is one that I feel like is important, and I wanted to address it. So first of all, treble hooks, the legality of it is black and white. We don't need to talk about that. There's a lot of places I've been where treble hooks are not legal at all. You'll get single barbless hooks as a requirement in some places. There's places in Alaska where it's a single hook, doesn't have to be barbless, but it has to be a single hook on a lure, so you have to take all the treble hooks off and replace with one single hook somewhere on that lure. There's lots of places around the country where you just can't legally use them, and that's pretty black and white, and we'll talk about how we deal with that here in a minute. Another possibility is you just want to make fish handling easy, and there's been times over the history of Fishful Thinker television that I have purposely taken the trebles off just because we're catching a lot of fish, and I want to make handling them quicker. And when I say handling them quicker, you can read into that means easier on the fish, because the faster you can get fish, landed, unhooked, and released, the better they're going to be, period. End of discussion. We beat that horse to death over the years, but from the time you hook it to the time you let it go is a critical time frame. And if treble hooks slow you down, then you need to keep that in mind from the time frame, because again, as we've discussed a lot, delayed mortality is more deadly on fish than our physical wounds, and almost across the board, according to the people I know, including a fish physiologist with a doctorate who teaches it around the world at colleges. So the wound on a fish is not as big a deal, but the speed in which that fish is landed and released is very important, and especially the time that it's on the deck of the boat or on the bank or whatever it might be, super important. And so that's a key thing, and treble hooks can slow you down a bit in that scenario as well. And then the other thing that treble hooks can be, they'll slow you down, is they just get caught in your net and things like that more, and or in your boat carpet, things like that. And so there's people that want to simplify from that standpoint. Another scenario where maybe treble hooks aren't going to be super popular is with kids. And I've done kids derbies for years, not recently, but I used to do lots of kids derbies. I'd teach lots of kids to fish, lots and lots of kids to fish over the years. And I generally will not start them anywhere near treble hooks because of the fact they're just not quite as cognizant of their surroundings in most cases, and there's just a recipe for disaster when an 8-year-old kid starts getting all excited about fishing and he's winging a bait with treble hooks around on it. So we take them off from the safety standpoint around kids as well. And then there's a bunch of people that use them, love them, but that doesn't mean that they last forever, and they're, in my experience, less durable than other fish hooks. And I think it's probably because they get used or they get unhooked more with pliers, and they can be hooked in a couple of spots in the fish's mouth. I've seen many scenarios where there's all three of a treble hook caught in a fish in their mouth, or at least two of them, and it requires pliers to get them out, and typically you can bend the hooks up doing that. So I figured we'd talk about treble hooks and maintenance them, replacing them, things like that. And so I'm going to get into the meat of it at this point, since we've gotten through all the reasons why we may need to either replace them or take them off in favor of single hooks. So the replacement part is fairly straightforward from the standpoint that if a manufacturer puts a given size and wire weight of treble hooks on a bait, 99% of the time, I want to put that exact same treble hook back on the bait in terms of size and wire weight. What do I mean by wire weight? Well, you can get hooks that are 1x strong, 2x strong, 3x strong, 4x strong. I think it's about the strongest I've seen. But basically what that means is that the treble hook is thicker. It's not that it's any bigger, the wire it's made with is bigger. And where I typically see people wanting to upsize that is with big predator fish, and the other one being saltwater. So if you're taking a freshwater lure and you're going to put it in saltwater, or even some of the less expensive saltwater lures, and you're going to put them out there for big fish, you know, a big snook or something to bite, well, a heavier wire hook will, you know, lessen the chance that a snook is going to straighten your bait, or any other saltwater fish is going to straighten your hook for that matter. And you don't, that doesn't sound like it's going to be a big deal if you haven't spent a lot of time in saltwater, but I've had a fair number of hooks straightened over the years where you get your bait back, fish comes off, you're not sure why, you get your bait back, and one of the trebles is bent open, and that's a pretty good clear indication as to what happened, as to why your fish went away. So we will try to prevent that, I should say. In some cases, same thing with big predators, big pike. If I'm throwing maybe a relatively smallish bait for pike, I've seen a lot of scenarios where I do better with smaller baits, particularly like smaller jerk baits. Instead of a great big one, I use a small jerk bait, and you can oftentimes get some of your biggest pike to grab that, whereas they'll shy away from a big bait while all of their smaller, siblings, cousins, whatever, co-swimmers, let's call them, will grab the big bait recklessly, because I suppose that's how they get to be big pike. But at any rate, I've seen those scenarios. And so if you're going to upsize the wire on a treble hook, you got to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, the hook itself is heavier, physically heavier, has more mass to it. And because of that, depending on the bait, you may take a bait that floats and it will now be neutrally buoyant and it will suspend, or you may take a bait that suspends and it may sink. And so from that standpoint, you've got to be a little bit careful in swapping out treble hooks. And again, even in that scenario, I'm going to go to the same size, and I'm not typically going to upsize the bend in the hook itself, which is what the size references. So a size 2 treble should have roughly the same bend or gap across the branch. Doesn't matter what you use, but a 1x strong treble or a 2x strong treble or a 3x strong treble will have the same bend but with a bigger wire. So you're not making the hook bigger, you're just making the wire bigger and preventing that hook from bending. And so again, when I'm swapping them out for a heavy wire hook, then I will do so, but I will keep the same size, and that's very common. But I will be cognizant of the fact that it may change how my bait suspends or doesn't suspend in the water column. Now, along those same lines, since I do have that knowledge, I'm a big believer in suspending jerk baits in cold water. And particularly in the fall, going into the winter, a suspending jerkbait that slowly sinks is a great way to get a lot of fish, particularly in the bass family or pike family, to bite when they're otherwise not biting. And I mean slowly, like it sinks like, an inch a second or something like that, where it's a very slow sink rate. And a very easy way to accomplish that with a lot of different baits is by upsizing the treble hook and putting a heavier wire hook on there, and that will add some physical weight. So if you're talking about a treble hook and if you're talking about a jerkbait and it's got 2 or 3 treble hooks on it, heavier treble hooks will add enough weight in most cases to get that bait to get closer to suspending in cold water. So the little detail that gets lost amongst baits a lot is that they will only suspend at a certain temperature range. And that's because water changes density. When it gets colder, it's more dense. When it's warmer, it's less dense. So that jerkbait that suspends perfectly in 70-degree water will then float when that water's 40 degrees. And in 90 degrees, it might sink. So you can change out your trebles and fine tune that. And I very commonly will do that on jerkbaits, particularly in the fall and winter. I like the very, very slow sink rate at that time of year. Now in the springtime, conversely, I like a very, very slow rise on my jerkbait a lot of the time, and about the same rate, only the other direction. And in that scenario, I will then sometimes put lighter wire hooks on, and that will allow that to happen. So keep in mind, that's one way to fine tune whether your bait rises or doesn't rise in a water column or whatever. Another possibility being you've got a crankbait that's a floater, which is very common, and you want to slow the rise rate. When you pause it, you want to slow the rise rate on it. And you can again do that by using a heavier wire treble hook in a lot of cases as well. Some baits are extremely buoyant, and treble hooks alone won't be enough to hold the bait down in the water column, and you'll have to use little lead sticky weights or lead wire, something like that. But for the most part, you can generally make enough of an adjustment just by changing the weight of the hook itself. And again, I stay with the same size. And why is that so important, the same size? Because the ratio of the length of the hook to the gap of the hook is somewhat standardized. And you can buy a long shank treble hook, of course, or a short shank treble hook, although short shanks are very hard to come by. But if I change the size, I generally change the length of the hook as well. And then what you end up with is the hooks will tangle with each other more on the bait. And we've all had baits that do that, jerk baits that'll tangle on each other, crank baits that'll tangle where the two treble hooks tangle together. It completely kills the action of the bait, which, by the way, should be a clue that the hooks themselves are important. If you take the same two hooks and you tangle them on the bait won't run right. And that should tell you something right there. Generally speaking, I can feel as soon as the bait's hooks tangle with each other. So I don't like to upsize the size of the hook very often, unless maybe I'm taking the trebles off and using just one. There's a few scenarios where I'll take a 3-hook jerkbait, right? So, a jerkbait that comes with 3 different hooks on it, and I will take the middle hook off and I will leave the front and the rear hooks, but then to maintain the buoyancy, I will then make those each one size bigger than they were. And in that scenario, they will then be far enough apart that they shouldn't tangle with each other, and then save you some headaches right there. But that's a scenario where I will for sure change them out. And the only reason I'm doing that, 99% of the time, the only reason I'm going to do that is to, again, expedite fish handling. A jerkbait with 3 treble hooks on it can make getting even a 10-inch bass that's pretty durable, whatever, off the bait kind of a pain. And we don't even want to talk about it with trout. So I will do that, and I'll reduce the number of treble hooks on the bait. Now, since we're on that topic, another thing I'd be caution you is going to single hooks, and that's a whole subject that I'm going to get back to here in a minute. But don't cut out of this podcast right here and say, "Oh, I'm going to single hooks." We're going to come back to that here in just a minute. But the tangling of the hooks or the upsizing, downsizing of the hooks can be definitely an issue, and there's a reason bait designers do that. The weight of the treble and the size of the treble and all of those things are calculated at the time that the bait itself is made. There's a few baits that ship with significantly undersized trebles from the factory, or very cheap trebles from the factory, meaning that they're not a good quality hook, typically very soft wire, very malleable wire, not holding a point very well, or not particularly sharp in the first place. Those are baits I don't generally buy, but if you do, the first thing I would do is swap those trebles out for a better quality treble, because there's nothing more frustrating than losing fish. And cheap hooks, in the grand scheme of things, of fishing, hooks are way cheaper than most everything else. So it may be cheaper in some scenarios for you to just replace those hooks on a less expensive bait and call it a day, if that's the route you choose to go. And I've seen that a lot when I was working at Sportsman's Warehouse. I used to see that a lot. Guys would come in and buy very inexpensive baits and then head right for the hook wall and go from there, because depending on what they were going to do with those hard baits, it may not matter to them. But then they go swap the hooks out to make sure that the effectiveness is still there. So that could be a key thing with treble hooks as well. And so that's important. Another thing I want to throw out there is as far as the hooks themselves go, I don't like trebles that bend easier. So I want a high carbon steel. It's a little bit more brittle, but it's also sharper, and it's less less inclined to bend, let's say, under various loads. And usually for me, when I destroy treble hooks, it's one of two ways. It's either by doing it with pliers, because I'm digging around the fish and I bend hooks all out of whack. And yes, you can bend some of them back, but I promise you want a heartbreak, bend a hook back about 3 different times and then hook shamu with it. The more you bend it, the weaker it gets. You straighten it, it bends easier the next time. You straighten it again, it bends even easier the next time. You go to straighten it, it breaks, or you straighten it just fine and a fish bites it and it breaks. So again, it's a series of things that make that thing break. And you don't want that to happen. And that's the same with any hook, just for the record, not just treble hooks, but it's typically treble hooks that get bent. The other scenario is if you snag baits, and when you snag baits, it'll straighten them very easily. If you have a low carbon hook, a high carbon hook won't, or they will also sharpen or unsharpen, as the case might be, much quicker. So if you've got a low carbon cheap treble hook and you're grinding rocks with a square bill crankbait, and those hooks are touching those rocks, it's going to wear them out in a hurry. So then I would swap crankbaits a bunch. And I did an interview series back at ICAST years ago, and I asked a bunch of pros pro bass guys, how often they change hooks on their baits. And many of them said they would change treble hooks out over the course of a day's fishing on a specific bait. For me, that tends to take too long, so I'll grab a different bait that's the same, another example of the same bait if I have it. But if I don't, I will replace trebles. And yes, I carry a single box. It's a Plano 3700 box. It's the skinny model, the real thin one. And in that box is a whole series of treble hooks, basically going from an 8 to a 2/0. And then I will have the same line of baits, or same line of hooks, I should say, in a 2X strong as well, meaning that they're heavier wire. And I can use those for fine tuning, as the case might be. Those stay in the boat. And then I will also, in the bench in the shop, have 4X strong trebles, which I typically reserve for, as I said, wading jerk baits for wintertime or maybe saltwater. Those are very heavy treble hooks. And it's important to note that the thicker the wire is, the harder it is to get that hook buried. The thinner the wire is, it penetrates easier, so it doesn't take as much effort to get it buried. And that can be important to you as well, depending on the species of fish you're talking about. The bony or the mouth, something like a lake trout, you're kind of hung, because if you use a thin wire, it goes in really easy, but the flip side is they straighten easy, and a big lake trout could straighten them. So you kind of get yourself in a conundrum there of exactly which size and wire thickness you want as far as hooking something like a lake trout or maybe even a pike. So keep that in mind. Let's talk about replacing trebles, because really this is the root of the question I originally got. And treble maintenance, by the way, let me wrap up one more thing. Treble maintenance for me is day one stuff, the end of every year. In fact, all my crankbaits, jerkbaits, anything with a treble hook on it's on my bench right now, not in the boat. And I will go through those boxes one at a time, and I will keep track of how many hooks I need, and I will make sure I have enough on hand to replace them over the course of the winter. That's a great project, sitting in front of the wood stove and maybe sipping a cocktail of your choice and swapping out treble hooks. It's tedious, but it's a great winter project, not something I want to do in the boat in the summertime. So I will do that over the course of the winter. But anyway, let's talk about replacing them altogether with a single shanked hook. This is a big one, because now you can really mess up the action of a lure, and I mean mess it up. And there's all kinds of styles you can use. There's no black and white answer. I've tried all different kinds of hooks when I replace them. So let's start with a classic example of a hard lure of some sort that you need to replace them off of. So a jerk bait or a crankbait, let's say, or topwater bait. As soon as you take the treble hooks off altogether, the bait will not run correctly. And so the first thing I do is then take all the hooks that were stock on the bait and I weigh them. and I weighed the whole hook package that was on the bait, and then I determined from there how much the hooks need to weigh to get back to that same scenario. So for instance, when I was going to Alaska, the last time I went to Alaska, I brought everything with single hooks on it as it was required by law. So I had everything from topwater baits to walking, topwater baits, high rollers, things like that. I also had several jerk baits, and they all had to have one hook. And not only am I taking 2 or 3 treble hooks off, but now I only get to put one, and it can only have one shank on it. So to get them to run right, I did a couple different things. First of all, like I said, I weighed the hooks, and if I cannot get close to that weight, so let's say that, let's pick a jerk bait. Let's say it had 3 trebles on it. I take all 3 of those trebles, put them on my digital scale, and see what they weigh. If I can't get close to that weight with a single hook, then I know that jerk bait's either going to float like crazy or sink like crazy or whatever the case might be. And then I will use the split rings to fine tune the weight of the hook of the bait. So rather than put a giant super thick wire hook on trying to get the total weight from there, I'll take the 3 split rings on the bait that were on there off, and I will upsize those to heavier split rings, which again will add the weight back, and then it will cut the difference in the single hook that I have to put on there. When I have tested the hooks, going to a single hook, typically I like a medium shank. I don't want a long shank hook. I want a medium shank single hook, and from what I found, most of the time a 2X strong is a good all-around choice for replacing. I also want to keep track of the eye. I don't want like a Siwash eye, which is a big round eye, or a down eye or anything like that. I want a straight shanked, somewhere between 1 and 3X strong hook, and then I will put that hook such that the point rides down. If the shank of the bait is parallel with the shank of the hook is parallel with the bottom of the bait, then I want the hook eye down, not up, and that will give you a better hooking chance. As soon as that hook is up, and there's only one hook on there, a fish can collapse the bait, and literally the body of the lure will hide the hook from burying, and we don't want that. So I'll make the hook face down. And the other thing I figured out basically is most all of the baits will run best with that hook either on the front or second hanger if there's 3. So either up against the lip or the second hanger if there's 3 trebles, and if there's only 1 treble, then the baits will run better with the single hook at the front. And I figured that out across the board for anything from a stunna or a hit stick to any of the other jerk baits out there that you might be throwing. When it comes to a topwater bait, the Chapo, the high roller, the jaywalker, whatever the various ones you like to choose. For me, the drift walker is a good one. Then I typically will end up putting that hook on the back. And the reason is this: you get a lot of fish that will sip the bait, and it's great when they're headshotting it and you're getting them on the front hook all the time, but more often than not you're going to get sippers of some sort, particularly with something like a Chapo that's moving at a continuous speed. And I found that my hookup ratio is better with the single hook in the back, and again it's pointed up. If I put the hook in the front, my hookup ratio went down. The bait looks more natural in the water. I'm not going to lie to you. When you put let's say you take a popper, a bullet pop, a number 80 bullet pop. You put that single hook on the front, the bait looks better sitting in the water. With the naked eye and you put it in the water, it looks better the way it sits, but it does not hook nearly as well as if you put the one single hook on the back, which is going to make it ride nose high. But when you pull it with the line to make it move, then the bait will flatten itself out and it will work out just fine. But again, when I put the hook in the front, my hook ratio goes down, so it doesn't matter how many bites I get, because the bait looks better if I can't hook them. So I need to hook them, and that's important, and therefore that hook goes in the back. I have also been in scenarios with trout where real small baits, something like a little tiny hit stick, only has a single treble. That's an easy one. You can put a little short shank, single hook on the bottom of that, literally almost like a salmon egg hook or something along those lines, or a little octopus hook will work fine on that scenario because they're very small hooks, and they're going to have plenty more bite than the little tiny treble that was on there in the first place, and you're going to have an easier time dealing with trout. And if you're talking about something like a floating jerkbait, like I said, the hit stick, something like that, if it's got more than one, it needs to have the hook on the front, or the bait won't dive correctly, and it won't wobble side to side correctly as well. So if you're having a hard time getting the bait to balance by putting the hook on the front, then the easy answer is to put an extra split ring on the back. So leave the original split rings that were on there. Whenever I swap hooks off, I'll leave the split rings, unless I purposely change them for their weight. I'll leave the existing split rings. But if I get a bait that's not balancing right, like for instance, I had some issues with some of the big hit sticks with a single hook, and I just flat couldn't get them to balance right. So I put some beefy split rings on the very back of the bait. And somebody out there is going to say, well, why not lead? Why not lead strips? Why not lead strips? Well, in some areas you can't use lead, for one, and for two, they don't stick a lot of the time. And so in that same box with the treble hooks that I already mentioned, that Plano 3700 box that's in my boat, there's a selection of split rings and a bunch. And you can put a lot of split rings in one compartment. So I make sure that I've got a bunch of split rings, and they're again varying in heaviness or thickness of the wire. And I will do that and use that to adjust the weight of the bait. But I'm going to tell you right now, in my experience, it is very difficult to get any of the technical, the touchy baits. In other words, a stunner, a jerkbait of some sort, any kind. It doesn't matter what brand I mentioned. A suspending jerkbait is a finicky beast, and getting it to run exactly right with the hooks off it and a single hook put on it can be very, very tricky. And in a lot of cases, I've seen some where I really just couldn't get them to run how I envisioned they should run, or how they ran with the treble hooks. But I'll throw out there this: in a lot of scenarios, particularly with something like that jerkbait, unless you're talking about a long pause scenario, a high-speed jerkbait, it generally speaking doesn't matter, because you can accommodate that with the rod tip and how you're working the bait, how fast, how hard, how much cadence you're working with, all of that. And those are ways that you can adjust the performance of that bait with the rod rather than the hooks themselves. Because again, Dan Spangler, good friend of mine, leads the hard bait development team at Berkeley. They come out with a lot of baits. That guy's had his hand in a ton of baits. There's a bunch of scenarios where he's like, it's just real difficult to get a bait to run the same once you swap the hooks out. And he spends hours and hours and hours over days upon days using the treble hook positions that are built into the bait to finally get the bait to balance how he wants. And by that I mean he'll make different prototypes and move those hooks frontwards and backwards within the bait until he gets it where it balances right. And then some bozo like me comes along and takes those hooks off and wants to put different hooks on, and the bait just flat doesn't work like he did, and I don't have the opportunity to do prototypes. So I do what I can to make the baits run as close as they did previously, but in some scenarios it just flat ain't gonna happen. Along those lines though, in some of those scenarios, it won't matter. So the ones that I get really, really sticky about is any bait that's gonna suspend and need to sit still or very slowly move. So typically that's a jerkbait or a topwater bait. The topwater bait I've already mentioned, I have not proven that I get any less bites if the bait doesn't sit exactly the same sitting still as it does moving. And when you do pull on it, the resistance of the water will straighten the bait back out anyway. Something like a jerkbait that sits nose up or nose down, extremely nose up or nose down, you won't get the bites, period. It won't happen. And so you've got to get a little bit closer to how that bait originally sat in the water, or you're going to ruin the action of that bait. And so the last thing I'll throw out there when it comes to treble hooks, good quality treble hooks aren't cheap, but they're cheap insurance in the grand scheme of things. So I don't buy cheap treble hooks. Everything I buy is Fusion 19s. They're fantastic hooks. They're affordable but not cheap, and I keep lots of them on hand because it's the cheapest insurance against losing fish. The only variance from that, there's been times when I've gone to saltwater specific hooks, but otherwise everything gets a Fusion 19 on it regardless, all the way down in size or up in size. and then wire sizes from there. So hopefully that information will help you out a little bit with the treble hooks. Just understand, as soon as you replace them. Oh, one more thing I want to point out. Hang on, back up. I'm going to back up. One more thing. Inline spinners, because this was something the guy just talked to me about, just sent me an email this morning. He wanted to know how he gets the single hooks off his inline spinners. He went out and bought a bunch of rooster tails, and he wants the trebles off them. Unfortunately, there's no way to get the treble off that without using a pair of side cutters to cut the treble off. If it's got a split ring, it's obvious. You just swap it out. But if it doesn't have a split ring, I will cut the eye of the hook, install a split ring on the loop that the eye of the hook was originally wired to on that bait, and then I will drop my hook behind that, my single hook behind that. And again, in that scenario, it's going to be a shorter shank because I don't want the overall length of the bait to get bigger. So that's how I deal with that, and that hopefully will take care of you. Or you can contact Buddy Money, makes inline spinners, which are fantastic, because they have a single hook on the back that's attached to a swivel, no less, and really cool stuff. So thanks, David Leong, for those. I love the way you build those. So, guys, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it, as always, to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I hope you'll subscribe wherever you are. Share it with your buddies. It's a labor of love. It means a lot to us, and it's important. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker.